All right, ladies and gentlemen, before we get started, let's check the mailbag. We have a couple of messages that have come in. We'll start with George Williams. He sent an email to say, I wanted to encourage your shows on classical antiquity and thanks for involving the Greeks. I'm so excited there will be more. I've read several classical authors, though I still have lots to get around to reading in modern translation. I particularly enjoyed the discussion of the foundation of Greek myths. Keep up the good work. George, thank you so much for your email. Thank you for listening, and thank you for taking the time to comment. I'm always glad to have people reach out and say that they enjoy the show. And we have, as I've stated, a few more antiquity themed episodes planned, and I'll just do it as long as I can and as long as I can find people who are willing to come on the podcast. We also have a message from Gordon Burris, who reached out to advise that he has been a lifelong Duke football fan. He loves football, grew up watching the Blue Devils as a toddler, and he is glad that there is another podcast in which we give some respect and attention to the best fan base and best football school in America, which is Duke University. You heard me, SEC. It just means more here. All right, and with that, on to the episode. And as always, go Duke. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the not classical antiquity themed, this time, Bull City Coordinators Duke football coverage podcast. We are going to get into not necessarily a Duke themed episode, but instead we're going to discuss the conference that the Blue Devils are a part of, the future of that conference, and the current state of the conference. And we are going to do that with someone who has spent more than 20 years covering the ACC and covering the teams that are part of the ACC, including some school down the road nearby the Blue Devils I've never heard of before. I don't really know what their name is, and who cares about them? But he is a columnist for the News and Observer. He's been there since 2000. During that time, he has covered 7 Final Fours, the Summer Olympics, the Super Bowl, and the Carolina Hurricanes Stanley Cup. How about that? Luke DeCock, other than covering the North Carolina Tar Heels, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good. I dip into a little bit of everything. But I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. The first thing I want to start with is it is currently approximately 3 p.m. on February 28th, 2024. Is there still an ACC as of the time that we're speaking?
As far as I know. Yeah, big news today. They inked a new sponsorship deal with Dr. Pepper and Orange Crush. So everything's fine now. That's it. Everything's been saved. We're all good. Yeah, ACC's Dr. Pepper is going to save the ACC. Interesting. In the release, it says in conjunction with ESPN marketing, which just reminds you that the ACC is not really a college athletics conference as much as it's a television network that also plays sports and does business with other television networks. But I assume we'll get to some or all of that in the upcoming minutes here.
Well, with Dr. Pepper and Orange Crush, we are going to rock it like it's 1975. So good for the conference, I guess, right?
Apparently they outbid RC Cola, and Dad's root beer. So I guess that's good news for the ACC.
Did Blenheim get in on that? Because I love some Blenheim.
How about like Sprecker's root beer? I guess that's probably more of a Big Ten thing, but yeah, no, Blenheim or the Gosling Black Seal ginger beer is actually some of the finest ginger beer out there. It's shocking that something branded to make a dark and stormy is actually as good as it is, but it really is. I'm not getting paid. This is not a plug. If they want to pay me, that's fine. I'll plug Gosling's Black Seal Diet Ginger Beer on every podcast I go on. But yeah, no, that's but it's just another example. Like everything's, and this has been true for a while. Everything's for sale. The ACC is very much trying to generate more revenue, and college presidents and commissioners and ADs will run down the street chasing a nickel into traffic because that's all they care about.
Speaking of chasing down nickels and people needing money, we're going to talk about Florida State in a minute. However, before we get to that, well, I guess it's I guess let's just kind of ask this. If we're going to cast blame on the current situation that the conference finds itself in, is it Jim Phillips? Is it the member schools presidents and leadership bodies, the athletic directors, what have you? Is it the dads and chads, which is a Swafford reference? Who should we be looking to, or what group of people should we be looking to in allocating fault, which as an attorney is something that I deal with every day, and a parent too, but
Yeah, I would say it's Florida State, it's Miami, it's Boston College post 2010 or so. The reality is the ACC has been left behind because its football product hasn't been good enough, and football drives the bus. Football is what determines is the rationale for every single decision being made in college athletics. So when you look at the last 20 years ago, 2004, 5-ish, the ACC was at the top of the game, right? They had basketball. They had added Florida State. They're expanding. They're adding Virginia Tech and Miami and Boston College. They're cementing their position as the premier East Coast conference. And what's happened since then? Basketball's continued to decline in importance. Football's continued to accelerate in importance. And in that period of time, Miami's gone in the tank. Florida State, with a brief heyday under Jimbo Fisher, has been in the tank. Boston College went from playing in ACC championship games to struggling to get to 3 wins. Georgia Tech at one point under, previous regimes, Bobby Ross and all that, was competing for national titles. This was a league and Clemson went through a period, let's not forget, about the same time where Clemson wasn't very good. At the same time, the big brands, Michigan, Ohio State, obviously just about everybody in the SEC except Vanderbilt, continue to accelerate their football product. And what ended up being a sort of demarcation line in college sports is if your half-awake uncle happens across a football game on the television on Saturday afternoon, does he stop? Well, guess what? He stops for Florida State. He stops for Notre Dame. He may stop for Nebraska. But the brands that he stops for Miami. But guess what? In the last 20 years, if you stop on a Florida State game or a Miami game, it's probably going to be terrible. Whereas Michigan and Ohio State and schools like that, obviously the Alabamas of the world, have been at the top of the period. So how did the ACC get left behind? Failure has 1,000 fathers, but the number one thing is at a time, an era when football became the end-all be-all of college sports, the ACC was not competitive in football. And then you get into the makeup of the conference, right? It's a mix of a couple big public schools, some smaller private schools. It doesn't have those Ohio States. It doesn't have the Mississippis that have a gazillion alumni, all of whom will fly 30,000 strong to every bowl game. It's got brands. North Carolina's a big brand. Virginia's a big brand in that sort of idea. But you've also, and Duke is a bigger national brand, but you've also got smaller private schools like Wake Forest, Boston College, very regional, very small alumni bases, small enrollments. It's very difficult to compete in terms of television ratings or bowl tickets or any of the things that the people who make decisions about sports don't really care about sports. They just care about, what money can they squeeze out of this. ACC just turned out sort of to be very poorly positioned for this sort of current wave of what's happening in college sports. The upshot of that is if the ACC had been better in football, which it was sort of into the BCS era, it would not have been left behind. And you go back to the 2010-ish, where it had bulked up in football because it did see this coming and added football brands. I mean, Virginia Tech's another one. Virginia Tech has been almost irrelevant for the last 10 years. It was the Thursday night team, man. Enter Sandman, Thursday night, Big East. That was a big deal. Virginia Tech, Miami, whatever. And Virginia Tech has not lived up to its end of the bargain. Although I would argue, and this is kind of a sidebar, and I think this is going to be true of SMU as well. Of all the schools the ACC has added, Virginia Tech actually fits the best. Like culture-wise, mentality-wise, regionally, it has rivalries. Their fans get along with other ACC fans. They're not always whining about how the tournament's not at Madison Square Garden or pretending they're not in the league like Syracuse or Notre Dame fans. Virginia Tech's actually fit pretty well, and that was the school the ACC didn't want. I think SMU is, despite not having any geographic sort of congruity is going to fit okay. Like I think SMU is going to be a decent fit. But to answer your question, were there issues with the television deal when it was extended in the 2010 period? Absolutely, there were. And I don't know that the ACC could have gotten a network then, like the Big Ten and SEC, because it did need to expand again, and it did need a grant of rights, and it did need to be better at football, quite frankly. But it could have gotten closer and moved that process up. It could have accelerated that process. There's no question about that. And that left it behind. So, yes, I mean, I think John Swofford made some very good decisions. I think he made a couple decisions that ended up having sort of unexpected long-term consequences. I don't think much of the blame goes to Jim Phillips, who inherited a really bad situation. That said, he's done absolutely nothing to move the ball forward. He's basically, I like the guy. I think he's very smart. I think he's a good and decent human being. I think he probably was a pretty good athletic director. But there's no vision or proactive. The sum of ACC messaging on this stuff is, did you see our statement? And oh well, we're going to send Corey Alexander out on the media tour. Like they have one. The SEC has 1,000 surrogates. The ACC has one surrogate, and it's the most loathed person in the entire league. So, Jim Phillips has not exactly made the most of the situation. There's no question about that. I think he is a little bit hamstrung by the fact that the presidents have more power than they did when Swofford was commissioner because of how the league's been restructured. And I don't think the presidents have any idea what they're doing. They bear a large share of blame for the current state of the league. But when you get down to it, to answer what is essentially your question, which is why are we talking about the future of the ACC in 2024 when its television deal still has 12 years left to run? The answer is because for a 15 to 20-year period, the ACC was dog crap at football, and it fell behind, and it's paying the price now.
And there are a couple things that I do want to mention. Your comment about failure having 1,000 fathers, none of those ever acknowledge paternity, though. That is key in these situations. And also, we've mentioned Notre Dame, complete mistake, total disaster, chasing that white whale. It has not worked out for us.
I don't disagree, but let me push back real quick on that. The ACC has failed at various points to exert pressure on Notre Dame. There's no question about that. But I would argue that the scheduling deal with Notre Dame has been a net positive. The fact that Duke gets Notre Dame coming in, Duke goes to South Bend, all the ACC schools get that. Those are big games. And Notre Dame sells tickets. And it's a big deal to put your alumni on a plane and take them to South Bend. Did the ACC give away the cow and give the milk for free and all that? Absolutely. Has the ACC gotten something out of it? I think that part of it gets overlooked, that the ACC has benefited in some ways from that part of it. Now, I think you can pick that deal apart and all of that. But look, nobody's been more critical of that deal than I have for various reasons. And to the point where I actually got in a conversation with people at Notre Dame saying, I'm not angry with you. You are doing what you're supposed to do. You are acting in Notre Dame's best interest. The ACC has set it up where your best interests do not coincide with the ACC's best interest. That is an ACC problem, not a Notre Dame problem. Like, as I wrote, you can't blame the raccoons for getting in the trash if you didn't lock the lids. That's what Notre Dame is. Notre Dame is a trash raccoon that is going through the ACC's trash because the ACC hasn't locked the lids. That said, the scheduling deal has provided benefits to the ACC that don't get talked about a lot. And I think that's important to mention because it hasn't been a total zero. And it generally gets portrayed as the ACC has just absolutely gotten taken to the cleaners. And I don't think that's the case. Is it flawed? Absolutely. Is the ACC waiting around? Yeah, look, you can drive Notre Dame home. You can do Notre Dame's homework. Notre Dame is not going to go out with you. That much is clear at this point. But it has not been a total zero.
Right.
Sorry, and you were moving on, but that point gets brought up a lot. And I feel like the counterpoint, which is some of this has been good for the ACC, does not get talked about as much.
And I think that is a very fair and reasonable take. I will just point out Big East and its non-existent football teams now. And when we really had leverage in COVID, we dropped the ball. But that's not, again, Notre Dame's fault.
That's a fair, yeah. The COVID thing is interesting, and it's funny because I actually thought at first that they drove a pretty good deal. and that Notre Dame, once having a taste of actually playing for a conference championship and what that meant, would want would be less reticent to fully embrace that. And I probably underestimated the degree to which the really old, crusty, crotchety Notre Dame alumni have control of that school, which I do understand now, whatever it is, 3-4 years later. I do have a sense of who is really in control at Notre Dame. And they are the most reactionary piece of people you can possibly imagine. I mean, there's like 300 trustees, and like 2/3 of them are basically 95 years old and think that, Newt Rockne is going to come back from the grave and lead the Four Horsemen to a national title. Until that whole generation dies off, and or Notre Dame is left out of the college football playoff when it should have gotten in, which is still something that could happen even under the new format. Like I still think that Notre Dame may wake up one day and be like, holy crap, we would have been in the CFP if we were in the ACC, and we're not. I mean, that was a little bit true last year. No one wants to talk about it. If it had been a 12-team playoff last year, Notre Dame might have been left out, whereas they would have gotten in if they're in the ACC. Ironically enough, in the year the ACC absolutely got shafted. But anyway, I do think the worm will turn on Notre Dame, but I understand better now why it hasn't and what has to happen for that to change, if it ever does.
And speaking of things that have to change, let's talk about going from one abusive relationship, that being Notre Dame and the ACC, to FSU and the ACC. Full disclosure, I stopped reading the amended complaint. I couldn't make it through there. I could go on for a while, but I won't. But you yourself, sir, are cited, I think, a couple of times in that document. What is it like to be cited in a pleading that is trying to destroy a conference that you have spent a great deal of your career covering?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think that it's interesting that they cited one column in particular, and it's the one they cited is apropos of what we just talked about. The ACC has a Notre Dame problem, and it's not the losing streak, which talked about some of the things we've already talked about. But the things that they cited were things like ACC football is what's put the league in a bad position, and football drives the bus in college athletics, and schools in the ACC don't always act in the conference's best interest. So it's actually interesting what I am cited for in there is very peripheral to Florida State, and actually kind of peripheral to the ACC in some ways. That said, I think I made a lot of jokes last summer about Florida State's going to go start its own live football league with Boise State and all of its girlfriends from Canada that you don't know. And I do think that there's a little bit of dog chasing the car here, where Florida State's going to get a hold of the bumper and be like, what now? If it does, sort of win legally. I mean, most of this to me is when I read these complaints and the pleadings and the arguments, it all feels like very first world problems. I think the root cause of all of this is Florida State's unduly elevated opinion of itself as a football brand, which I thought was, and I'm surprised the ACC hasn't brought this up, because I mean, there's a lot of things that the ACC's lawyers haven't brought up that I would have brought up by now. But number one is, if Florida State is such a big brand, why was it left out of the college football playoff despite being a conference champion? That to me suggests that Florida State is maybe not the big swinging, is not the big gun that it thinks it is.
Well, and there is a lot of noise about the stuff in the amended complaint, or the second amended complaint, whichever one it is, about implying that the only reason BC got in to the ACC was to help out Chad Swafford is just absurd. But what that complaint is really about, it's just about FSU wanting more money than it can currently get from the ACC. All this other stuff about we were treated unfairly, we've been done wrong, that's just garbage. I mean, that's just complete garbage. It's just, we want more money. Let us out of this deal so we can get more money.
Yeah, which is interesting to me, because one of the ways that they're arguing that is that Florida State has somehow been defrauded, which is a fantastic claim, that you, as a member of an association that you participate in, have somehow been defrauded by that association. You sound like you want to express opinions on that.
Well, I just wanted to say, where is the stuff about what FSU knew, what it was told, what information it had at the time it signed off on the deals. So I'm just saying I would not put a lot of faith or belief in that fraud garbage.
Right. Unfortunately, and I'm not the lawyer, by my reading, that the fraud argument is basically why they should be released. We've been defrauded. We should be released from these documents that were fraudulently agreed upon. But yeah, they really don't do a very good job of clearing what should be a high bar. In this case, even can't clear even a low bar of how exactly they were defrauded by voluntarily entering into agreements where they have yet to show how they weren't fully informed about it. The other part of it is, okay, and again, this is like the dog that catches the car. You say you can make more money if you weren't attached to the ACC. How are you going to do that? The SEC and Big Ten are both basically at this point functioning arms of ESPN and Fox. If they had wanted Florida State would already be out. Like, look at UCLA and USC. Like, look at Oklahoma and Texas. Grant of rights, all this stuff. Like, that stuff is all fungible when the pieces start moving. Like, if UNC legitimately has an opportunity to join the Big Ten or SEC, we are not going to be standing around trying to figure out how they're going to get out of the grant of rights. They are going to say, we are out. Come sue us. Come find the hat. So a lot of this is, part of the problem with Florida State, and this is a Florida State thing, they have a very vocal and political board of trustees. They all think they're football coaches. They all think they're athletic directors. So you have this sort of, it's almost like a show trial at this point, like this very sort of Stalinist show trial. We're going to put the ACC on, like this entire Florida State's entire legal complaint reads like a message board post, and the message boarders are in control down there, and that's why we are where we are. There is no exit plan here. Whether they're going to put private equity, live football, if you were worth that much money, somebody would have offered it to you already, and you wouldn't be scraping together nickels to try to get out of the ACC for this big money plan. So the whole thing to me is kind of a waste of time. That said, circle back around to this. The ACC has left itself open to this. It doesn't communicate well. It relies on statements. It has no public presence. There's no Greg Sankey out there going on Feinbaum. There's no army of surrogates spreading the ACC story. There's just a commissioner who issues statements, and like the ACC championship game. Joe Tessitore's in the booth on an ACC broadcast on ESPN, their business partner, their 50-50 business partner, talking about how Florida State doesn't deserve to be in the championship and any SEC team would be a better fit, or whatever he was saying. It was, SEC propaganda. If I were Jim Phillips, I would have been in that booth at halftime with Jimmy Pitaro on speakerphone saying, we're in business with you guys. Your own guy is in here slagging us. He doesn't have to, stop, at the very least, stop propping up the SEC, stop ripping our own team and our own championship game. Who are we in business with here? So, but of course that didn't happen. And it ended up being a 4-hour SEC infomercial. But the ACC loses that messaging battle every time. And that's why a school like Florida State, that's full of people who that message is not getting through to, are suing the ACC like a bunch of message boarders, because they don't believe that the ACC is doing the right things. They believe they've been defrauded. And a lot of that is just the fact that the perception that the league is, I don't want to say incompetent necessarily, but that the league does nothing, that the league is sort of inert.
Well, I do think, and a couple of things I wanted to follow up on, for all his faults, Swofford would have handled this situation better. I'm not convinced that it gets to this with Swofford. I think some sort of deal he could have worked out. But to your point, if FSU wants to go somewhere and another school wants it, blowing up a grant of rights is not helpful for a number of reasons, because all these conferences, and most important, their TV partners, need enforceable grants of rights to make these contracts, make the broadcast, make all this stuff work. And so I could see where Fox and ESPN and whomever else are saying, this is not helpful here. What you are doing is not helpful. Yeah. And, there was some talk, and I do want to add this on, there was some talk about how the ACC was kind of implying through a pleading that it filed saying, hey, let's talk money, that's kind of what was coming up. For everybody who's listening, I don't think that's what the ACC was saying. Granted, I'm not licensed to practice law in North Carolina or Florida, so I may be off base on this, but it seemed to me what was being said by the ACC was Florida State is saying this exit fee stuff is a penalty, which could create issues under Florida law. The ACC is saying, no, this is just a contract. This is a normal contractual dispute, and the damages in a breach are monetary damages. It's not a penalty. That's really all that was being said. But that kind of brings us back to the main point, which is the ACC has a grant of rights in place till 2036. I guess the TV deal hadn't yet been unilaterally extended by ESPN. But what does Luke DeCock see as the future of the ACC? What does it look like? And I know this is just complete speculation to a large part, but just what do you think happens next?
Well, I think, as we get closer to that 2036 mark, probably the 2030, 2031 range, the schools that have options are going to start looking for ways out. Like, I don't think the ACC as we know it is sustainable for the long term, which, look, I'm not bringing any news here. The conference explicitly said that's why it added Cal and Stanford and SMU. We're worried about going below 15 members, so we added 3 more. Like, they're basically saying we know we're going to lose schools, so we're adding now, which I think is the backwards way to do it, but that's a whole nother podcast of why the expansion was a terrible idea. But here's the other part of it. We talked about television networks earlier. This isn't sort of like a video game where you have options and it's like choose your own adventure. All of this is determined by what ESPN and Fox will pay for. Right now, the television market, because of rights market, because of streaming, and because of the new whatever they're called, Spulu and cord cutting and the Diamond Sports Bally situation, the rights market for television sports right now is very bad. It is not what it was 5 or 6 years ago when Fox was willing to give the Big Ten money to add UCLA and USC. You can see it by how the Pac-12 fell apart. They thought they were going to get $50 million a school from ESPN, and the money wasn't there. It might have been there in 2018, but it wasn't there in 2023. So this is a terrible time to take sports to market, which is what we're seeing with the CFP. People talked about this being an NFL-style deal with multiple rights holders. NBC would get the Notre Dame games, and Fox and ESPN would split it up the way that CBS and Fox split up the NFL, and maybe Amazon would have a piece, like they have a Thursday night game, and ESPN or maybe another network or Apple TV right. This was going to be all very multifunctional and no, I mean, basically when they went to market, the only person actually willing to pony up was ESPN, which will then potentially sublicense some of these games to other networks. But there wasn't that opportunity like the NFL typically has to do this big, multifaceted, we're going to farm out little pieces, we're going to chop it up and get more money. It was basically ESPN saying, hey, it's us. We can work out a number and maybe we'll sublicense some, but there wasn't that appetite for breaking that up into big pieces. So right now, that's why what Florida State's doing is crazy. Like, there is no appetite right now for people to spend more on television rights. The NBA is having some of the same issues. As we get closer to 2030, what the television rights market looks like then is going to have a lot to say about what options a school like North Carolina or Virginia or Miami or Florida State or Clemson has. The big brands, North Carolina, Virginia, Clemson, Miami, Florida State, will always have options that the other schools don't. If the league starts to fall apart, there will be parachutes for those schools. There will not be parachutes for Pitt. Like, that's just, and I think when you look at schools like Duke and Pitt and Wake Forest voting for the expansion, which I think was a terrible idea, it was done out of panic that they wouldn't have a league unless they started adding schools. Under the assumption that really the 3 schools that voted no, Clemson, UNC, and Florida State, would look to move elsewhere at the earliest opportunity. What I wrote at the time when this happened was, This is going to accelerate that process. I thought it was going to happen in the 2030 to 2032 range once you got to the point at the end of the grant of rights where you could potentially buy your way out of that. If you had enough money coming in by jumping to the Big Ten, maybe the last 3 or 4 years of the ACC deal is penny ante stuff by then. If you're getting $100 million a year, you can buy your way out. It's fine. You get to the last 4, 5, 6 years of that deal, those numbers get smaller. I think the expansion has accelerated that process. I think Clemson and North Carolina are smarter than Florida State and are doing is behind the scenes rather than throwing a big screaming baby tantrum the way Florida State has. But rest assured, they are exploring their options in the same way. So I think that's what we're going to see as we get closer to 2030. Maybe that moves up to 2028 or 29. If there is a point where the rights market opens back up, where there's more, and it will. Television sports are not fun. I mean, it's like they're commodity. Like there's value, and that's going to go up. Especially as in a streaming world, this is one of the very few things that will tie people to a sort of linear, network type of thing. Live sports are valuable that way. They're just not right now in winter 2024. As those numbers go back up and as Fox gets an appetite, the current Big Ten is going to get stale to Fox. It's going to want to add pieces. ESPN is going to want to bolster the SEC, and it's going to do it by treating the ACC like a car parked on the lawn for parts. And when that point in time comes, then you will see some of these other schools get out, and then it's just a question of, is there a 12-team rump ACC left with, the private schools and NC State and, Virginia Tech maybe. I think the smart move would be when you see that coming would be to actually secede entirely and reform with more like-minded schools, like a Georgia Tech, NC State, Wake, Duke, Virginia Tech core. Probably makes a lot more sense than being in a league at that point with Syracuse and Boston College and Pitt, and Miami for that matter. So I think there'll be some very difficult decisions to be made, and people who are smart and innovative will find very good solutions. Unfortunately, the people running universities these days are neither smart nor innovative, and what they will do is sell off whatever assets they have to the highest bidder, regardless of what the long-term consequences are, which is basically the story of the last 20 years of the ACC.
Right. And if you look at when the TV deals start to run out and when the buyouts happen with like a year or two before, maybe 3 years before the grant of rights end and the TV deals end, 2027 is when we should all start marking our calendars to see what's going to happen. And hopefully by then we can create an Olympic sports conference, football conference separate, right? So we can actually have like a Big East style basketball conference. Wouldn't that be great if we could have that?
It's real. Like I do think that makes a lot of sense, and a lot of people have talked about splitting off football, and I think splitting off football makes a lot of sense, even more sense than it does now as we get closer to professionalism and employee status. That splitting off football becomes a better value proposition, but it's going to be so hard, especially in the case of the ACC, where you have this locked in potentially through 2036 to untangle football from the Olympic sports. Again, because football, we know from the Notre Dame deal with the ACC, football is 80% of that deal. Everything else, men's basketball, women's basketball, softball, wrestling, blah, blah, whatever. The rest of those rights, Notre Dame gets 20% of the rights fee for being in this league. So we know that if you unbundle 80% of the ACC into some other entity, that 20% that's left is not a lot. So that's going to be a really hard knot to untie. If you're NC State and your football moves up to a bigger conference and your 20% is left behind with all your other sports, how do you sell that to your alumni that your football may still be in a conference with UNC and Clemson and whoever, but your Olympic sports are now with East Carolina and Old Dominion and whatever. I think that, same thing for Duke. I think that makes more sense regionally, but it's going to be a tough sell for somebody. And it's just, there's so much money in football. It's going to be so hard to unbundle those other pieces. And that's before you even get to the issues with the NCAA tournament and conference alliances and automatic bids and things like that. It's a really complicated nut to crack. It's like what I used to say about paying athletes 10 years ago. Like college athletes are going to get paid. I don't know how. I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't have a plan. I don't have an idea. I know that over the next 5 to 10 years, college athletes are going to get paid. And that's exactly what's happened over the last 5 to 10 years. It has happened haphazardly. It's happened without organization. It's happened without leadership. It's happened without guidance. It's just sort of happened with the steam bursting out of whatever steams it can get out of. So I do think we will find a way to separate football. I don't have any idea what form that's going to take. My guess is it will have something to do with employee status and professionalization and all of that, but I'm not smart enough to draw a roadmap on that one. Nor do I think is one drawable at this point because of the way the rights fees are all sort of intertwined.
Part of what makes that complicated is the issue that's related to workers' compensation, lifetime benefits, health insurance, all those sorts of things. Those are a bigger deal than probably what we talk about as an attorney who sees some, not that I handle comp cases, but I'm aware of large workers' compensation payments that come out. But you said that it's a significant knot to untie. Everybody who listens knows I've got a side quest that is a classical antiquity themed portion of the podcast. I'm going to make a reference here. What we need is an Alexander the Great to untie the Gordian knot. We just have to find that guy. Don't hold your breath. So, Luke, I know you're busy. I know you got a deadline. You got to cover some team somewhere. I don't know what they're called, whatever it is that they do. But I hope you have fun with that, and you got to get there. Again, not sure what team it is, but one thing that I like to do is I give people who come on the podcast an open mic to talk about issues that are important to them or that they want to talk about, or just to vent about Jim Phillips if they want to vent about Jim Phillips. I mean, whatever. If you want to talk about classical antiquity, we could do that too. So I'm going to give you the floor. The floor is now yours.
Yeah, no, I don't need to vent about Jim Phillips. As I said earlier, I don't think he's a bad guy. I mean, I think he's actually a good guy. I think he's a smart guy. I just have not seen a lot of agency from him so far, whether that's him or the presidents. I will say I'm going. I want to talk about a tremendous missed opportunity on the part of the ACC. Several years ago, I wrote, it was a snow day. I was trapped in the house. I wrote that the ACC should play the 75th ACC tournament, at least part of it, at Reynolds Coliseum. Renovated Reynolds, it's very nice now, small, obviously, but still, as a nod to how the tournament got started. And I had a number of conversations with people in Raleigh, people at NC State, people at the ACC. Would that be possible? And in the tournament, 5-year tournament sites just announced a couple of weeks ago, they put the 2028 tournament in Charlotte instead of Greensboro. It would have worked. You could have potentially played the Tuesday games in Raleigh and then moved to Greensboro for the rest of the tournament. So I just think that's a great example of how the ACC continues to take the easy way out, the lowest common denominator, instead of doing something clever and a nod to its history. They're just going to play the same boring tournament in Charlotte, which, hey, nothing wrong. We get 5 tournaments in North Carolina. That's great. Obviously, the ACC had to do that because they took the $50 million to keep the office in the state. But I just feel like it's a great example of the kind of smart things that, not just me, other people have ideas like this. I just had this happen to just be my little baby. There are a lot of things the ACC could be doing if it were smarter and more clever and more nimble. But instead, it's, got these sort of 1986 era promotional campaigns like Accomplish Greatness, very sort of dated and hackneyed and cliched. So, I think one of the reasons schools like Florida State and other schools that are quieter about it are frustrated with the ACC is that sort of inability to change and adapt. And I don't think Brett Yormark would have been the right hire for the ACC, but I'll give that guy credit. He took over the 4th place conference when he took over the Big 12 and has tried just about everything he can to shock some life into it, bringing in musical acts and playing games in Mexico. And, he was dealt a losing hand and he's playing it the best he can. And you just don't see any of that from the ACC. I don't know if that's Jim Phillips or the fact that it's basically entirely the same staff as it was when Swofford was there. So there hasn't really been any new blood, or it's the fact that the presidents are just have an iron fist on things and they're just not very good at this. Certainly in the case of Randy Woodson, we know he's not. I just think when you talk about the sort of vibes around the ACC, one of the reasons everybody's a little antsy, I think, is they just get a sense that the lights are on, but nobody's home.
So if let's assume your tournament model was adopted, would the Grand Marshal be Jim Boeheim?
Well, I mean, I don't think Boeheim's issues were always with Greensboro.
Well, you said, but being Greensboro on a Tuesday, so that's
so you would play the Tuesday games in Reynolds Coliseum in Raleigh, and then the rest of the tournament would go on like normal in Greensboro, like you would if the whole thing were in Greensboro. But on Tuesday you would have this celebration. You could have all the legends come back between the first and second games because you're playing 3 games in a 4-game window. You could have like a ACC film festival. You could, there's a million things you could do if you wanted to put in the time and thought and effort, and just, doesn't seem like anyone wants to.
Which makes me think, who are the new ACC basketball legends we're going to get?
Ronnie Cycli. I always said that when ACC legend Ronnie Cycli was the moment where I was going to throw my hands up and walk away. If it's Ronnie Cycli's year, then I think weren't they already announced?
I unfortunately don't pay attention to that because everybody in the ACC hates everybody else. But I can't think who would be the Cal, Stanford, and SMU ACC basketball legends. The football one, we got Marshawn Lynch. That's a win.
Jason Kidd.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
that's a win.
Sure.
That's a big win. So then is the tournament loss between that Duke had to Cal that year and Hurley's senior year, is that now a conference loss?
No, but it's future ACC network documentary fodder. So you can look forward to that between the tax shaver commercials on the ACC network.
On that's a mic drop. Luke, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Everybody, you know where to find us. You know where to listen to us, bullcitycoordinators.com, at Duke FB coverage on all the socials. And as always, go Duke.